There is a moment quiet, invisible to cameras, hidden behind palace walls that changes everything. It is not a speech. It is not a public announcement. It is not something printed in a newspaper or confirmed in an official statement. It is a single hand reaching forward and another hand moving to stop it. That is where this story begins. The British royal family has always operated on a system of invisible rules. Who stands where? Who speaks first? Who inherits what? Who has access to the treasures locked away in the royal vault, jewels that were worn by queens, carried through coronations and passed down through bloodlines stretching back centuries. These are not just objects. They are power. They are history. They are the physical proof of who belongs and who does not. For years, people on the outside have watched the surface. They have seen the smiles at garden parties, the coordinated outfits at royal engagements, the careful waves from palace balconies. Everything controlled, everything perfect, everything exactly as it should appear. But in the summer of 2026, something slipped through the cracks. A wedding, a royal vault, a woman reaching for something she believed was hers to give, and a prince, the future king of England, stepping in to stop her. The moment lasted only seconds, but what it revealed had been building for years. This is the story of what really happened, not the version seen in photographs, not the version released in careful statements from royal communications teams. The version that insiders have described in hushed conversations. The version that speaks to something far deeper than jewelry, a battle over legacy, over authority, over who truly holds power inside Buckingham Palace. It starts with the Queen Mother. It moves through decades of carefully guarded royal tradition, and it ends with a confrontation that nobody expected and nobody will forget. The Queen Mother's rings were not ordinary jewelry. That is the first thing anyone who understood the royal family would tell you. They were not decorative pieces selected from a catalog. They were not gifts from a jeweler or tokens picked up during some foreign state visit. They were objects that carried the weight of an entire era inside them. Pieces that had sat on the fingers of one of the most beloved women in the history of the British monarchy. A woman who had stood beside a king through a world war, who had refused to leave London when bombs were falling, who had become the definition of quiet, unshakable dignity in a way that no press release could ever manufacture. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had passed away in 2002 at the age of 101. By the time she died, she had outlived her husband, outlived the century that had defined her, and outlived nearly every expectation that anyone had ever placed upon her. She had not been born to be a royal. She had married into it. And yet, in the way that the most extraordinary people sometimes do, she had become more central to the institution than almost anyone born inside of it. Her jewelry was legendary. Collected across decades of royal life, it included pieces that had passed through the hands of queens going back generations. Some items had been gifts from foreign dignitaries. Some had been passed down within her own family. Some had been specially commissioned for specific occasions, coronations, jubilees, state visits. Each piece told a story. Each piece had a history attached to it that could not be replicated, could not be purchased, and could never be fully replaced. Camilla's own engagement ring, the ring she wore when Charles proposed to her, was a piece that had once belonged to the Queen Mother herself, a refined vintage design featuring a 5-carat emerald-cut diamond, flanked by 3 baguette diamonds on either side, platinum set in Art Deco styling. That single fact told you everything you needed to know about how royal jewelry worked. These pieces moved through the family like living things. They passed from hand to hand. They marked transitions, signaled alliances, and carried meaning that went far beyond their monetary value. Queensmith, which was precisely why, when the question of royal jewelry access arose in the weeks before Peter Phillips married Harriet Sperling, it was not simply a question about accessories. Peter Phillips was the son of Princess Anne. He was Queen Elizabeth II's first grandchild, and while he had lived something of a quieter life compared to the more prominent members of the royal family, stepping back from royal duties, working in a private career, he remained deeply connected to the family. He and Prince William had grown up together. They were close in the way that cousins can be close when they have shared an unusual childhood, when they have both stood at the edges of extraordinary events and navigated them without a map. Before Peter Phillips married pediatric nurse Harriet Sperling on June 6, his cousin, future King Prince William, and Queen Camilla are said to have gotten into a serious disagreement over the bride-to-be's use of the family jewelry collection. AOL. The question seemed simple on its surface. Would Harriet be permitted to borrow a piece from the royal collection for her wedding day? It was a tradition with precedent. Royal brides and women connected to the royal family had borrowed pieces from the collection before. A tiara, a ring, a necklace wearing something from the royal vault was not just a fashion choice. It was a statement of belonging. It was the family saying, quietly but unmistakably, that you were welcome, that you were recognized. That the history carried inside those pieces was something you were now allowed to share. The answer, however, was not simple at all. According to insiders, Camilla had flat-out objected, and William had wanted his cousin and close friend to at least have the option of a family piece. The disagreement reportedly became intense enough to be described as a heated talking point in the run-up to the ceremony. International Business Times. To understand why this moment hit with the force that it did, you have to go back. You have to understand not just who William and Camilla are in the present moment, but how they arrived here, through what history, through what grief, through what years of careful management and restrained tension. Because nothing that happened at Peter Phillips' wedding came from nowhere. It was the surface expression of something that had been building underground for a very long time. William had grown up knowing two things about Camilla that existed in permanent, painful contradiction. The first was that she was the woman his father loved. The second was that she was, in his mind as a child, the reason his parents' marriage had fallen apart. Diana had spoken openly about it. The public had formed their opinions about it. And William, as a young boy who adored his mother and watched her suffer, had formed his own opinion too, one that did not easily soften with time. Royal watchers and insiders had long noted that what appeared publicly to be a routine family celebration at the Peter Phillips wedding was, behind the scenes, a dispute that extended far beyond wedding jewelry. According to those familiar with the situation, the disagreement spoke to a deeper conflict about protocol, influence, and the future direction of the monarchy. BTS Times. That deeper conflict had a specific shape. It was about power. Real power, not ceremonial power. The kind of authority that dictates who gets access to what, who makes decisions about how the family presents itself, who gets to draw lines around history and say this belongs to us and not to you. Camilla, as queen consort, held a formal position. She was the wife of the king. That gave her a defined place in the hierarchy of the royal family above most, below Charles. But there was another hierarchy operating alongside the official one, and it was generational. William was the Prince of Wales. He was the heir to the throne. As Charles's health had required the family to manage a careful transition of responsibilities, William had been stepping into a larger role, attending engagements in Charles's place, representing the crown in contexts where the king's presence was limited by his medical needs. William had been becoming, quietly but unmistakably, the future. And the future does not always move gently past the present. Royal experts had begun to note a growing tension between William and Camilla as Charles's health became more prominent in conversations about the monarchy's direction. One analyst described a situation where Camilla was reportedly seeing William trying to create issues, and had spoken to Charles about it. AOL. The question of who controlled access to the royal jewelry collection was not a small question in this context. The royal vault was not simply a collection of expensive objects. It was a symbol of continuity, of tradition, of the family's history made physical. Controlling access to it meant controlling who was welcomed into that history and who was kept outside. It meant deciding which moments were marked by the full weight of royal legacy, and which were allowed only the trappings of a normal family celebration. Harriet Sperling was not a royal. She was a pediatric nurse. She had lived a professional life caring for sick children, and she had raised a daughter from a previous marriage before finding her way to Peter Phillips. She was warm. She was accomplished. She was exactly the kind of person who, in a more straightforward family, would have been embraced without hesitation. But the royal family is never straightforward, and the question of whether she could wear a piece from the family's jewelry collection on her wedding day had become the flashpoint for something much larger. The rings associated with the Queen Mother's legacy carried a particular emotional charge. These were not simply valuable stones in precious settings. They were objects that had lived through history, objects that connected directly to a woman that William had adored, a woman who had been a steady presence in his childhood during years that were often turbulent and painful. The Queen Mother had represented something stable to him, something genuinely warm. something that felt like unconditional love in a family, where love was sometimes tangled up with duty and protocol and public performance. For Camilla to have authority over those pieces, to be the one who decided whether they could be worn, who could touch them, who was worthy of carrying that history forward, was, in William's view, something that needed to be examined very carefully. He had said nothing in public. That was not how William operated. He was not a man who made scenes. He was not someone who allowed private disagreements to spill into press conferences or newspaper columns. But the palace walls have ears, and the people who move within those walls talk. And what those conversations said was that the tension between William and Camilla had reached a point where it could no longer simply be managed with polite distance and carefully coordinated public appearances. The conversation happened, it was real, and it was not a small one. What exactly was said, and by whom, and in what precise sequence, that is something that exists only in the memories of the people who were present. But the shape of it was clear enough. William had raised the question of Harriet's access to royal jewelry. Camilla had made her position known. And for a period of days that felt, to those close to the situation, much longer than the calendar suggested, the matter sat unresolved in the tense space between two people who represented different chapters of the same family story. One a queen, one a future king. One standing in the present, one already living in his mind in what came next. And between them the question of the Queen Mother's rings, and what it meant in the end to decide who got to wear them. There are moments in any institution, a company, a government, a family, where the question being argued is not really the question being argued. Where two people are fighting about one thing, but the fight is actually about something else entirely, something older and heavier and harder to name. The argument about wedding jewelry before Peter Philip's ceremony was exactly that kind of moment. On the surface, it seemed simple. Was a woman who was about to become part of the extended royal family allowed to borrow a piece from the royal collection for her wedding day? In isolation, that question had a fairly clear answer shaped by precedent and tradition. Pieces had been lent before. Brides connected to the royal family had worn historic jewelry at their weddings as a gesture of welcome and inclusion. The practice was not new. But nothing exists in isolation inside the British royal family. Every gesture carries context. Every decision about a ring or a tiara or a brooch lands inside a conversation that has been running for years, sometimes for decades. The question of Harriet's jewelry was not being decided in isolation. It was being decided inside a palace, still managing the long aftermath of Diana's death, still navigating Charles's serious illness, still adjusting to the uncomfortable reality that the man who would one day sit on the throne was not a distant figure in waiting. He was already here, already present, already making decisions about how the monarchy would look in the generation ahead. At the core of the dispute was a fundamental question about authority. Who decides who can wear what from the royal collection? Camilla was said to see William's intervention as a straightforward breach of protocol. William, meanwhile, was understood to believe those decisions should rest with the king, or with him as heir to the throne, not with a consort who had married into the family in 2005. International Business Times. That last part was the painful edge. Camilla had married Charles in 2005. She had not been born into the royal family. She had not grown up with the traditions of it, had not been shaped by its rhythms from childhood, had not carried its weight through a lifetime of formal duties and ceremonial obligations. She had come into it as an adult, as a woman who had been in the public eye for a different reason entirely. As the third party in the marriage between Charles and Diana, the presence that many people, including Diana herself, had identified as central to the breakdown of that relationship. William knew all of this. He had lived through all of this as a child. He had watched his mother navigate public grief while managing private pain, had watched her give interviews that exposed the most intimate failures of her marriage, had watched her become, in the global imagination, the wronged woman, beautiful and broken and utterly alone. And he had done so as a boy, which meant he had processed it in the way that children process things that are too large and too complex for the emotional language available to them at that age. He had simply absorbed it, stored it somewhere, carried it forward. He had eventually reached a kind of peace with Camilla's presence in his father's life. He understood as an adult that his father needed companionship. He had watched Charles be happier in the years since their marriage than he had been during the long and painful years of the first marriage. He accepted it. He managed it. He was, publicly, respectful and civil. But acceptance is not the same as warmth, and civil is not the same as close. The Queen Mother had been someone entirely different to William. She had been present in his life in a way that was uncomplicated by the tensions of the adult world. She had been old when he was young, and her age had given her a quality of steadiness that the rest of his family, fractured and watched and constantly under pressure, could not always provide. She had sat with him, listened to him, made him feel, in the particular way that grandparents sometimes can, that the world was not as difficult or as fragile as it sometimes appeared from where he was standing. Her jewelry was part of that inheritance, not just the financial or dynastic inheritance, but the emotional one. The pieces she had worn were connected in his memory to images of her, to moments with her, to the specific texture of her presence in his life. When he thought about those rings, he did not think about asset values or historical provenance first. He thought about her, the woman who wore them, the hands that had held them. And the idea that access to those pieces, or to pieces of that generation of royal jewelry, could be simply blocked, refused, decided against by someone whose connection to the family came through a marriage and not through blood or through the decades of shared history that William carried in his body. That idea sat very differently than a mere policy disagreement. Reports described William as furious, with a source saying he was disgusted that Camilla would try to stir up trouble on his cousin's wedding day just to show off her power. His close relationship with Peter Phillips was part of what made the situation feel particularly personal. Stylcaster. Peter was not a distant cousin. He was someone William had grown up alongside in the unusual pressurized environment of royal childhood, a place where the people who truly understood your experience were very few, because the number of people who had ever lived that experience was very few. They had navigated the same strange world together. They had been to the same events, managed the same expectations, felt the same tensions between private life and public role. And Peter's wedding was supposed to be a moment of uncomplicated joy. A day that belonged to him and to Harriet, unmarked by the undercurrents that so often ran beneath the surface of royal occasions. William did not want that day to carry this particular tension. He did not want his cousin's wedding to become the site of a power struggle. But the struggle had already begun before he made a move to stop it, because Camilla had already made her position known. According to sources, the disagreement between William and Camilla had become a huge and heated talking point in the days before the ceremony, with insiders indicating that William was furious about Camilla having effectively blocked Harriet and Peter from access to the royal jewelry collection. BTS Times. The atmosphere in the days leading up to June 6 was not easy. The people who moved between the relevant households, the staff, the advisors, the people whose professional lives consist of smoothing over exactly these kinds of situations before they become visible, were working carefully to manage something that had developed a life of its own. A disagreement that had started as a question about a tiara had expanded into something that touched on succession, authority, legacy, and the very particular emotional geography that exists between a man whose mother was Diana and a woman whose history with that family began in the way Camilla's did. Nobody wanted this to be the story of Peter's wedding. And so the people around both William and Camilla were working, quietly and with considerable urgency, to find a resolution before the cameras arrived, and the guests assembled, and the day became permanent record. According to reports, William allegedly stepped in to try to overturn Camilla's ruling, to push back against the block that had been placed on Harriet's access to pieces from the royal collection. AOL. What happened in the rooms where that pushback occurred is not available in any public record. It happened in the way that the most consequential conversations inside the royal family always happen, in private, with no recordings, with only the impressions carried out afterward in the minds of the people who were present. The palace does not take minutes on these moments. It simply absorbs them, files them somewhere deep, and continues operating on the surface as though the surface is the whole story. But the surface is never the whole story. Even though the jewelry dispute eventually became a moot point, Harriet chose to wear a tiara loaned from Pragnell, the family jeweler that had designed her engagement ring, The atmosphere between William and Camilla at the wedding itself was described by insiders as frosty. The pair barely acknowledged each other, but kept things very civil in public. International Business Times. Harriet's choice to sidestep the entire conflict by sourcing her own tiara was widely described by people close to the situation as an act of extraordinary grace. She had removed herself from the battlefield without appearing to notice there was one. She had turned up on her wedding day looking beautiful, wearing something that belonged to neither camp, and had made the conflict irrelevant through the simple act of not needing anything from anyone. One insider said her choice speaks more about her diplomacy than William or Camilla winning and getting their own way. BTS Times. But William and Camilla still had to stand in the same space, still had to move through the same rooms, greet the same guests, manage the same day. And the knowledge of what had passed between them in the days before sat in the air between them with the particular weight of things that have been said and cannot be unsaid, decisions that have been made and cannot be unmade. Charles and Camilla also left the wedding early, departing the ceremony before the reception concluded to attend Derby Day at Epsom Downs Racecourse. That decision drew its own commentary. One source noted that the optics of leaving a close family wedding early to attend a horse racing event were difficult, saying that weddings are rare family milestones, and that when senior royals leave before the celebrations are fully underway, it naturally attracts attention and sparks debate about priorities. AOL. To those watching carefully, the early departure felt like a statement of its own, intentional or not, aware or not. It added a note to an already complicated day, one that the people who loved Peter Phillips and wanted his wedding to be simply a wedding found difficult to fully set aside. The day closed the way it had to close, gracefully on the surface, with photographs and toasts and the formal rituals of a family celebration managed by people who are very good at managing appearances. But behind what appeared in photographs, there was the thing that had happened, the confrontation, the disagreement that had reached into the vault of royal history, into the jewelry of a woman who had died years ago but whose memory still lived vividly in at least one person present that day, and had refused to resolve itself quietly. It had been papered over, but paper is not stone. And what was under it was still there. After the wedding, the quiet did not feel like peace. It felt like the quiet that follows something important, the particular stillness that settles in after a conversation that has shifted things, after a decision that cannot be walked back, after a line has been crossed or drawn or acknowledged in a way that changes the landscape even if the landscape appears, to anyone looking in from outside, exactly as it always did. The British royal family has always been expert at appearance. Generations of training, some explicit, some absorbed simply by being inside the institution, have produced people who can stand in the same photograph as someone they deeply disagree with and show nothing. Nothing in the eyes, nothing in the shoulders, nothing in the angle of a smile that gives away the interior state. It is a form of performance that is so refined it barely registers as performance anymore. It simply looks like composure. It simply looks like dignity. But the people inside the institution know the difference. And so do the people who work closely alongside them, the advisors, the household staff, the communications teams who are always the last line of defense between what has actually happened and what the public is allowed to see. In the aftermath of the Peter Phillips wedding, those people were busy. According to sources, Camilla was still furious even after the jewelry dispute had technically been resolved by Harriet's independent choice of tiara. The underlying confrontation had not disappeared simply because its immediate cause had been removed. International Business Times. The thing about an argument over principle is that it does not end when the specific occasion passes. The principle remains. The positions that were stated remain. The understanding of where each person stands, what they believe they are entitled to, what authority they believe they hold, all of that remains intact. Harriet chose her own tiara. Good. The day went ahead. Good. But William had challenged Camilla's authority over the royal collection. He had made his position known, and Camilla had heard it clearly. Observers noted that the jewelry dispute had fueled broader speculation about the relationship between William and Camilla, and what it suggested about the future direction of the monarchy. BTS Times. The broader speculation was not unfounded, because what the Peter Phillips wedding had made visible, even briefly, even only to those who were close enough to see it, was a structural reality inside the royal family that had been forming slowly for years. Two centers of gravity, two visions of how the institution should function, two people whose relationship to the throne was defined by entirely different logics. Camilla was the queen. She had earned that title through her marriage to Charles. She occupied it with a kind of careful, deliberate grace, someone who had been through too much public scrutiny to be careless about anything, who understood that every action she took was being measured against the expectations placed on her by people who had never fully stopped seeing her through the lens of what she had been to Diana's marriage. She managed her position with intelligence. She was strategic in the way that survivors are strategic, not manipulative, but clear-eyed, alert to threats, unwilling to cede ground unnecessarily. William was the future. He was the Prince of Wales, the heir, the man who would one day sit where his father sat. And as Charles's health had required the family to make careful adjustments to how responsibilities were distributed, William had been living more and more fully in that future, stepping into spaces that the king could not always fill, representing the crown in contexts that required the specific energy of someone younger and more able to absorb the physical demands of constant public duty. He was not waiting to become king. He was, in many practical ways, already becoming it. These two realities did not fit together without friction. They were not designed to coexist easily. A queen who holds authority in the present, and a future king who is already beginning to exercise the authority of what he will be. These two forces will always, eventually, find a point of contact where neither can simply step aside. The Queen Mother's jewelry was that point of contact, or rather the question of who controlled it was. Camilla's own connection to the Queen Mother's jewelry went back to her engagement ring, the Art Deco piece that had once belonged to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother herself. That detail had always carried a specific kind of weight. It had been a gesture of inclusion when Charles gave it to her. It had said something about where Camilla was being placed within the royal narrative. But it had also complicated things, in the way that gestures of inclusion sometimes do when they are made against a backdrop of complicated history. The people who loved the Queen Mother and grieved for Diana saw that ring on Camilla's finger and felt two things at once. And those two things did not resolve into one feeling simply because a wedding had taken place. Queensmith, William had grown up inside that unresolved feeling. It was part of his internal architecture. And when the question of the royal jewelry collection came up in the context of Peter's wedding, it did not arrive as an abstract policy question. It arrived loaded with everything that came before it. Every memory, every absence, every moment of watching his mother be diminished, and then watching the woman his mother had identified as part of that diminishment move into the position that now gave her authority over pieces that his grandmother had worn and loved and left behind. You cannot separate the personal from the institutional in a family like this one. The jewelry sits in the vault not just as an inventory item, but as a piece of the family's emotional history. And who controls access to that history is never a small question. Royal experts had noted that the growing tension between William and Camilla was in part driven by the question of influence. Who the king listened to, who shaped the decisions being made about the monarchy's direction, and how much space William had to begin functioning as the future king while Charles was still on the throne. AOL, what happened at Peter's wedding was, in that sense, a test, not a deliberate one. Nobody planned for it to become that. But the moment Camilla made her decision about Harriet's jewelry access, and the moment William pushed back against that decision, they had both revealed something about where they stood. They had shown their hands in a way that was small enough to be managed, but real enough to matter. The wedding day itself proceeded. The photographs looked as they were supposed to look. The people present conducted themselves with the practiced composure that the royal family requires of its members in public spaces. Charles and Camilla attended the ceremony. William was there. Kate was there. Insiders described the atmosphere between William and Camilla at the wedding as something that could be felt even without seeing any visible sign of it. A tension you could cut with a knife, they said, even as the two of them managed to keep things civil on the surface. International Business Times. That kind of tension is its own communication. The people who work around royals learn to read the space between bodies, the quality of a glance that lasts half a second too long or half a second too short, The particular way that two people who have had a serious disagreement stand near each other at a public event when they have agreed, tacitly, to behave as though they have not. It is a skill. It is also, for the people watching it from inside the institution, a kind of signal. And the signal being sent in the weeks after that wedding was one that the people paying attention understood clearly. The question of who holds authority inside the British royal family was not yet resolved. It was not going to be resolved by a single wedding or a single confrontation over a piece of jewelry. It was going to be resolved across time, through the accumulation of moments like this one, moments where the future and the present come into contact, and neither can simply give way to the other without consequence. The Queen Mother's rings, the pieces associated with her legacy, the jewelry that carried her history and her memory inside it, had become, in this moment, more than objects. They had become a symbol of the question that the royal family was now living with, not just who could wear them, but who, in the end, had the authority to decide. That question would not be answered easily. It had too much history under it, too many years of grief and distance and careful management and things said in private that could not be repeated in public. It was the kind of question that families carry for a very long time before they find a way through it. For now, the rings sat in the vault. Harriet had worn something else on her wedding day. The photographs from June 6 showed smiles and sun and the ordinary beauty of a family celebrating something good. But inside the palace walls, in the rooms where the real conversations happened and the real decisions were made, the moment lived on. William had stepped forward. Camilla had held her ground. And the distance between them, always there, always managed, always papered over with protocol and public performance, had made itself felt in a way that could not be fully undone by anything as simple as a polite evening at a cousin's wedding. The institution moves forward because it must. The future becomes the present whether or not everyone inside the institution is ready for it. And the man who will one day be king had made something clear, not in a speech, not in an announcement, not in anything that could be printed in an official statement. He had made it clear the way the most serious things in the royal family are always made clear. In the moment when it mattered, in the space between public and private, in the quiet that nobody outside the room would ever fully know, but that everyone inside it would never entirely forget. The Queen Mother's rings were still there, waiting, as things of value always wait, for the right hands, for the right time, for the moment when the question of who truly holds the past is finally and irrevocably answered.